All right. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews with Justin Clark. How's it going?
Hi. It's going great. How are you?
Great. Yeah.
Awesome. As I was mentioning in the chat, we have a little bit of a different setup this evening. This will be kind of the way I look now because I'm doing this with my laptop now instead of my desktop. And I got a little light behind me, so hopefully I don't look too much like a ghost.
Yeah.
And I'm really just excited to be here and discuss this interesting book tonight.
Right on. So what book are we talking about this evening?
So this is the first book that I read actually after I had my surgery in December. And it is a short little book, but a really important one called Existentialism is a Humanism by JeanPaul Sartre. And so for those who don't know, JeanPaul Sartre was one of the sort of pillars of post-war French intellectual thought in the 20th century. Not only was he one of the fathers of mainstream existentialism, kind of made existentialism go into sort of the mainstream, but he was also a longtime political activist. He used to hang out with Fidel Castro and supported the African independence movements in the 1970s, and was a longtime sort of political ally and longtime Marxist. So his political philosophy is something that sort of developed in him later in his career. The first half of his career was mostly devoted towards literature, and because he's also a novelist and a playwright, and he spent a lot of his years doing that. Of course, the political themes were always there, but by the 1960s, they would become more and more prominent in his work. There's an excellent essay by the French philosopher Alain Badiou in his book Pocket Pantheon about JeanPaul Sartre, and it's a great essay. I highly recommend people kind of check that out if you want to learn a little bit more about who Sartre was. But this little book that was put out by Yale University Press is actually a collection of two pieces of his writing. We're only going to be talking about the first part because the second part is a review of Albert Camus' The Stranger. It's sort of a book review of that. And I don't want to have people go through that who have not read the book because it kind of spoils the book. And ultimately, a lot of what he discusses won't make a whole lot of sense unless you've read the book. So we'll be talking mostly about the big part of the book, which is Existentialism is a Humanism. Now, the text of this was originally a speech that was given in Paris on October 29th, 1945. So this is literally weeks after the end of World War II. And in many ways, Sartre wrote this speech, which was in some respects sort of prepared. A lot of ways, it was fairly extemporaneous. By this time, his well-known and best-selling work, Being in Nothingness, which is the sort of main text of his existentialist thought. It's like over 800 pages. And I've read some of it. I've written some of it years ago when I was an undergrad. I wrote about it. What this little speech does and what this book does is it actually kind of distills a lot of the main themes of Being in Nothingness into a very short read that you can kind of take a lot away from. Okay. And one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this book for a Red Reviews was for a few reasons. One, it holds a little bit of a sentimental value to me since it was the first book I kind of read after having my sinus surgery back in December. So it was really fun to be able to sit despite having, giant splints up my nose and not being able to breathe all that well yet. Being able to read this book and get something out of it. And it felt really connected to me. The second thing is that I think that JeanPaul Sartre has one of the most, I think, inspiring and humanistic forms of atheism that you will ever read.
Nice.
So because I think a lot of times we don't always explicitly talk about this sort of skeptical atheist component of leftism and I am a secular humanist. I'm an atheist. I find that as a part of who I am. And what Sartre does in Existentialism is a Humanism is he really fleshes out what it truly means to not believe in God. And in a way that is super compelling and interesting. So let's kind of get into it. So this book was written as sort of a response to two groups. One was the Christians, particularly the Catholics. You have to remember France to this day is still a predominantly a Catholic country.
Yep.
They sort of accused him of, sort of being a vulgar, immoral person because he was rejecting God and traditional forms of morality. But in many ways, he actually also wrote this speech and later essay as a response to the French communists, who had also been heavily critical of him because they believed that his theory of existentialism was nihilistic and anti-materialist. So they sort of thought of existentialism as being, anti-Marxist, which having known Sartre and his work, that's completely not true. So what is existentialism? And, for those who aren't familiar with philosophy, existentialism kind of has its roots in 19th century philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. And then the sort of largest 20th century influence of it besides Sartre was Martin Heidegger, whose very influential book, Being in Time, was sort of the first major tome on the subject of existentialism. And then Sartre would sort of take Heidegger's ideas and flesh them out even more into Being in Nothingness, and then, of course, the essay. So what does existentialism do? The first thing that's really important is that existentialism foregrounds human subjectivity. So it acknowledges the subjective nature of existence, that yes, we do live, and existentialists do believe that we live in an objective universe that sort of exists independently of us, but we can really only experience it subjectively. So that's, I think, where he got criticism from the Marxists, because they thought of his philosophy as being too subjective.
It sounds postmodern, right?
Right. And in many ways, Sartre would be an influence on the later French postmodernists like Derrida and Foucault and others.
Right.
But Sartre, when he says that human subjectivity is important, it's because that's truly the only thing we have. We are only discussing things with each other through symptoms of the body, right? As McGinn says, Colin McGinn, another philosopher I like, he always says, I can only experience you through symptoms of the body. Like, we're talking, you're hearing me, you're seeing me, right?
Yeah.
But what also is important to existentialists is that, and this is echoing Marx, is that existence precedes essence.
Yes. Yeah.
So that there is an objective world. Like, we do exist in an objective universe that's made of objective things,
right? But
we experience them subjectively.
We don't have a pure, unfiltered access to it, but we do. But it is there.
Yes, exactly. So with that in mind, one of the really crucial components, alongside sort of understanding the centrality of subjectivity, understanding that despite that subjectivity, that existence precedes essence, right? So I think, and that echoes something that Marx and Engels wrote in the German Ideology, which is that life precedes. I think it's like life precedes circumstances instead of circumstances being preceded by life, or something like that. Basically, I forget exactly what it is. I forget exactly what the quote is from German Ideology, but they basically say the same thing. So when I find it interesting that, that's it. It's from the German Ideology, they say life precedes consciousness, not consciousness precedes life. So that's echoing what Sartre would write, nearly 100 years later. So one of the other really and crucial components of existentialism, and particularly in this, is that God does not exist. So existentialism is thoroughly atheistic.
Right.
And its atheism is so radical. I cannot stress this enough, and this is why I like it so much. The atheism of Sartre and existentialism is so radical compared to what you would get out of some of the mainstream atheists. And the reason for that is because God doesn't exist, the only being whose existence precedes essence is man. So in that respect, like the gauge of human sort of like goals or perfection is humanity. Like we are all we have. And that we are, and as a result, because there is no God, we have a direct responsibility for ourselves and others. And so, and that in many ways, in order for us to have responsibility for ourselves, we have to have responsibility for others because we live in a system.
Yeah.
And so and this sort of, this push and pull that exists between knowing, having the knowledge that we're on our own and that we have responsibility for ourselves and others is what Sartre calls as anguish.
Okay.
Which is actually a term that he gets from Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher from the 19th century, who's sort of the godfather of existentialism. If you want to learn a little bit more about Kierkegaard, I wrote an essay about him and anxiety. It's on my blog.
Cool.
But Kierkegaard was extremely religious.
Right. Yeah, that was the one thing I remembered about Kierkegaard was
Kierkegaard is extremely religious, but like not in a very traditional way. Like right. Spinoza, his version of God is so radical compared to what others would write about. And his conception of Christianity was also very, very different. You know, Kierkegaard didn't believe in sort of everything being about the beliefs. He really cared a lot more about works and how you lived life as Christ and so on and so forth. He was much more interested in sort of action and responsibility, which is exactly what Sartre cares about.
Right.
Because in many ways, Sartre's view of humanity and its relationship to itself and others is very influenced by Kierkegaard, but it strips the God stuff out.
Interesting.
And so with the God stuff stripped out, that, you know, we sort of act. And knowing that we have this responsibility, we act knowing that what we do affects everyone and everything. And this is something where he's sort of echoing Immanuel Kant, and the categorical imperative. And what's that? So it's a moral concept from Kant, Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment philosopher, basically says that before you carry out an action, consider that what would the world be like if the action you're about to take was carried out by everyone?
Right. Universalize it. Yeah.
Yes. Universalize it. Would it work? So if like I steal something, if everybody stole something, that would probably be an issue. But I mean, we can get into the ethics of stealing them, but you know what I mean?
And there's good critiques of that universalization rule.
Absolutely.
Right? So
because sometimes things are contextual, right? The problem with Kantian ethics is that it's called I'm going to use another long philosophy word. It's deontological, meaning that it's completely divorced from reality. You're developing ethical conceptions regardless of whether or not they actually affect the real world or have any bearing on the real world.
Right.
But, and so, you know, and another term that Sartre uses is this term called abandonment, which is something that he gets from Heidegger, because Heidegger was also a hardcore atheist, is this idea that we must reckon with the fact that God doesn't exist. This is something that's also super important in understanding existentialism, is that there are sort of more traditional notions of atheism where we sort of lose God and it's like, oh, now it's like, the sun has come out and I'm so happy and everything is wonderful and it's going to be great. And existentialists are like, you don't have a fucking clue. Like, because here's the thing. We've had this society for almost 2,000 years that has been centered on this and we've abandoned it. And what are we going to do with that? We have to live with the anguish of it being gone, right?
Yeah.
This is something like, and I think we've talked about this before. This is something that like Jordan Peterson tries to articulate, but does it poorly.
Right.
Which is that, you know, kind of echoing Nietzsche, this idea that with God, with the death of God, the sort of, our society loses its sort of central node of moral worth and agency. And so as a result, we have to sort of figure out where we are.
Yeah.
And the difference between, say, like Peterson and somebody like Sartre is like Peterson's like, he's like kind of lamenting the fact that this happened. Whereas Sartre is like, no, I think this is a good thing, but we just have to work through what this means.
Right.
And I think that's something, and we've talked about this before, but like, I do genuinely believe that we as a secular society do have to reckon with the fact that for all intents and purposes, God is dead, right?
Yeah.
We have to reckon with the fact that God doesn't exist, that we're on our own, and that we have, and that our traditional notions of spirituality and morality, they all have to change. And we're basically, the autopilot on the ship has been turned off, and we actually have to pilot the ship now.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like piloting the ship, like autopilot being turned off and being in front of the cockpit of a plane and not knowing what any of the buttons do. And so then you have to sort of figure it out. Right. And so, because he writes about this, he sort of talks about how it being, the loss of God is a loss of finding values, which disturbs existentialists. And the reason it does is not so much because we care so much or they care so much about God, but because they care about morality, right? So with the God concept no longer being something that unites and sort of animates a moral society, we have, like I said, we have to figure out what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't have a clear answer yet.
Yeah, it's I mean, obviously there's various perspectives on this, right? There are people who still believe that objective morality is a thing, just not from God, right? And then there's people who think that all morality comes from consensus of personal or people, right? Which seems wrong. Both seem wrong. So it's like, where does morality come from, I guess, is the kind of the idea, right? Right.
Because humans, we crave certainty, right?
Yeah.
And so when we don't have that certainty, when there's so much ambiguity about what we're responsible for, it causes us anguish. And that's kind of what Sartre is talking about here. And so, and this is where we get to Sartre is probably his most famous phrase, besides hell is other people, which a lot of people know is from, I think his play Nausea, or not his book Nausea, but his play No Exit. And I think it's hell is other people, but they never finished the quote. I think the full quote is like hell is other people before coffee or something like that.
Okay.
But hell is other people, right? But the other phrase that Sartre is probably best known for is that humanity is, quote unquote, condemned to be free. That we are by circumstances, because the universe is what it is, because there is no God, because the universe doesn't care. We just exist. This is who we are. We have to figure it out. That we are literally compelled or condemned to deal with the responsibility of our choices. And so because without God, there is no universal standard of values. And therefore, man has ultimate responsibility for all that he does. Yep. Humanity has responsibility for everything, right? Yep. So we get to benefit from the successes, but we also have to lament and work through the failures.
Yeah, we have to recognize them and actually deal with them.
Yeah. And so, kind of with that in mind, sort of the other component to this, right? And thinking about, okay, well, if that sort of universal moral system is gone, what replaces it, right? And for Sartre, it's kind of mostly nothing, but in general, what really does replace it is the idea that morality is developed through purposeful judgment. So we can really only learn how to be moral by doing things. And he sort of says it as actions confirming or affirming affirmations. So like, if we want to be moral, like I want to be a good person in this particular situation, what would it mean within this particular context to be a moral actor? And you carry that out. And by carrying that out, you kind of figure out, oh yeah, that actually did work. That was good. Right. Or, oh, actually that didn't quite work. That's not great. A good sort of modern day example of what we're getting at here is the popular Reddit subreddit called Am I the Asshole?
Yep.
I don't know if people are familiar with Am I the Asshole, but basically like somebody will often share a situation that's oftenly morally ambiguous to a certain extent. And they'll ask like of three choices. One, am I the asshole? Two, are they the asshole? Meaning whoever they're interacting with. Or three, everybody sucks, right? And so it's really only after we figure, like, it's only really after something happens that we can kind of figure out whether or not it was moral. Right. And that's through discussion with others. Like, morality is a very discursive exercise, in my opinion. Like, I don't think, like, I'm not like Kant in thinking that, like, there's just like these universal moral principles that sort of exist. Yeah. I think they're predicated upon real living beings living in a real universe, making real choices. Right. And so it's all it's very much contextual. That doesn't mean that it's like completely relative, because I do think there are certain things that are better than others. But yeah, even then, like, yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking, like, as far as what where objective morals come from, like, people use the example of, like, murdering puppies is wrong. That's, you know, you can just say that's a contextless moral truth. But then that kind of thing doesn't apply to every situation. You can't always apply murdering puppies is wrong to, like, you know, every situation. So
exactly right. Because you could say, well, by murdering this puppy, you were able to save your child. You know, let's say you're in some weird scenario where your child and your dog have been kidnapped, and you have a choice. You either kill the dog to save the child, or you kill the child to save the dog. And then in which case, sometimes maybe that is the moral choice, right?
Given the context of the situation.
Right. And what is important about thinking through morality is that it's not relative, but it is subjective, in the sense that we are subjective actors just doing the best we can, right? Like, and that's the thing, is, like, I think that's what I like about existentialism a lot too, is it just acknowledges that, like, there's no sky daddy up there telling us what to do. Yeah. So we have to kind of figure this out on our own. And because of that, we're going to fuck up. Like, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to do things that are wrong. But each time is an opportunity for us to learn how to do it better or right the next time. Yep. And I like that, because it gives a sense in which morality is something that can grow and evolve and change, which I think is super important, because I think that this idea, because I used to be one of those sort of, like, morality is objective, blah, 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 moral landscape, Sam Harris. I used to be one of those people. And the problem with that whole worldview is that it kind of smuggles in moral precepts without justifying them, right? Yeah. And so, you know, because ultimately some of it does really come down to feelings. And feelings matter. Like, that's right. This is the other thing that's important with existentialism too, is that existentialism values feelings. It values how you're experiencing, because here's the thing, what you're experiencing often influences how you feel, and vice versa. Like, emotions are incredibly important. You know, even one of the most pinnacle figures of the Enlightenment, you know, David Hume, you know, said that reason ought to be the slave of the passions. Right. Meaning that we should have moral impulses that should guide us to make better decisions and not just be cold, rational beings. Because when you build a society that's built upon nothing but pure rationality, you know, you get concentration camps. Yeah. And you get like, that's like the most extreme evil version of it. Or you get what I think is like a horrible version, but is different in the sense that it's, instead of it being like brutally awful all at once, which is what the Holocaust was, it's sort of brutal slowly over time. It's like death by 1,000 cuts, which I would argue is living in the United States of America in 2022 under hellscape capitalism and a pandemic, right? Yep, I think that's fair. So there's a certain level of institutional and structural violence that is inflicted upon the populace. It's not as sort of it's not sort of as capricious or blatantly evil as the Holocaust. Of course not. It's different in the sense, but it's still brutal. It's a different form of brutality. Yeah. I tend to think also that, like, this kind of pure rationality, without any feeling, it's an illusion anyway, because even the decisions made that in the, you know, aim to be purely rational come from a place of emotion and, like, values that you can't necessarily put into words. Exactly. And that goes back to the subjective nature of human existence, that we are all experiencing things. Because here's the thing, emotions are natural. They're a part of who we are. They're a part of us being a highly evolved primate mammalian who has this extremely complex, neurological system that is constantly playing this sort of, chemical dance that will shape who we are. Yeah. And so it's just as materialistic in the philosophical sense, not in the sort of I like to shop sense.
Right.
That emotions are something that come out of the material universe. They're not something that just kind of come out of nowhere. And they matter.
It's really annoying that materialism also means I shop too much.
Right. And part of it is just people's, materialism in it's like libertarianism too, right? Because like libertarianism in political discourse is a disgusting, shitty position, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from fascism. Yeah. And libertarianism in philosophy refers to people who have complete and total free will, and that could be a justifiable position based on particular arguments. So like it's words are contextual, right? Just like morality is, words are contextual. Yep. But that is a discussion for a whole other day when maybe we read Wittgenstein or something.
Sure.
But anyway, the one thing that I kind of on the topic of materialism, Sartre sort of makes the argument that materialism should not lend itself to baser instincts. We should set our values higher than merely the material world. Yeah. And so we're constantly striving for something better than ourselves. This is sort of the sort of non-spiritual spirituality within existentialism as a philosophy, right? This sort of secular humanist ethic that we're striving to build something better. We're striving to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And that makes us fully human because, as he sort of writes on another page, it's like we attain our understanding of ourselves through others. Yeah. You can't really know who you are unless you have interactions with other people. You learn who you are through relationships with other people.
I think we've covered it with another book that we've talked about as well. Like, was that the Christopher Lasch book?
Yeah, that was the Christopher Lasch book. Yeah, that was The Minimal Self. Absolutely. Because what is it to not be able to do any of that? That's a narcissist. Narcissism is not so much just blind egoism. It's a complete inability to have any meaningful connections with others and with the world, where you can only see yourself.
Right.
And that's a huge issue for sure. Great tie-in with Lasch. I wasn't even thinking about that. The other thing about existentialism that's super important too is its universalism. So it does have a universalist component to it in the sense that to Sartre, there's a universal value to any project. So regardless of where you live, regardless of what language you speak, regardless of what ethnic group or racial group you come from, whatever political group you come from, there's a certain level at which I can understand you and you can understand me. We may not be able to understand everything, but there's a sense in which, let's say we had a perfect situation where, we had the Star Trek universal translator and everybody was in the room and everybody explained to each other their lives and their ideas and their projects. Everybody would kind of pretty much figure out what everybody else was doing.
Right.
And that's something that is really important to Sartre, and the humanistic aspect is that we're all human beings, that we share a common ancestry, that we share a common lineage as being human beings, and that universalism is so crucial to understanding how we can build that new morality, knowing that we're all together, right? Because previous moralities had notions of division where certain people were not considered human or things were not considered universal. And that by bifurcating humans into different groups, we actually lose our sense of humanity. And so that's another really crucial component to Sartre and existentialism.
Sounds like kind of an anti-nationalist type perspective.
Absolutely. And alongside that, one of the arguments you'll often hear against socialism is, it's against human nature. This is something you hear all the time. It's against human nature. Well, Sartre actually has a response to this.
Okay.
Not so much the socialism can't work as a human nature, but the human nature debate itself. So what Sartre writes about human nature is that he does not believe that there is a universal human nature, but he does believe that there are universal human conditions. And this is something I really, really like, is that this idea that, because human nature is such like a slippery phrase, like what does it really mean?
Right.
Whereas human conditions, you can kind of get a sense of like, okay, everybody has to eat. Everyone has to drink water. Yep. Everyone has to, everyone has to go to the bathroom. Everyone has to have sex. Everyone like there are components to us that are universal that every single human being on earth, I bumped my mic, every single human being on earth has a connection to. And so universal human conditions are very, very important. Again, underscoring the universal. And this is something that ties in to Marxism, because one of the crucial aspects of Marxism is going from the idea of a class in itself to a class for itself. When you acknowledge the universal nature of who you are within a certain context, i.e. the working class, or being under the boot of imperialism, when you acknowledge that with others, you can build a project that can reverse those things and lead to human flourishing.
Nice.
So that's, and as a result, because of our universal human conditions, we are compelled to make choices. We have to. Right. A human life without choices is not a human life. It's you have to have a sense of choice and responsibility, right? Like, we could use the Uncle Ben to sort of to really distill all of this. With great power comes great responsibility, right? Right. And the great power, so to Sartre, the great power is knowing that there is no God, we're on our own, and that we are the writers of our own destiny, right? So like that's the great power part. Okay. But with that becomes the responsibility of, holy shit, I am on my own. Right. This isn't like, I really have to own this now, right? And I just love that. I just think that's so cool because again, it puts agency back in our hands as human beings. That we are not, slaves to some structure that may or may not even exist. That we have a certain level of agency over our lives. Now, we don't have perfect agency, of course. Obviously, we are, clearly, as materialists, we all believe that our lives are determined by structures and systems that are far beyond our control, right? Yeah. But what is in our control is the way in which we interact with those systems, or even better, how we revolt against those systems when they are oppressive. Yeah, yeah. And so, his philosophy is very much a philosophy of human freedom, in the sense that we truly are free within a certain context to do as much as we can. So, like, we're free in the sense that we're not burdened with God anymore. We don't have to worry about that anymore. What we do have to worry about is building a new system that requires choice. And so we kind of, with that in mind, he sort of towards the end of the lecture, he talks about there are sort of two types of humanism. There's the sort of traditional notion of humanism, which is sort of the sort of, what he sort of calls the Comtean humanism. And he's referring there to Auguste Comte, the 19th century philosopher who sort of created what was essentially a cult of humanity, or sort of a cult of reason that would develop. And the problem with that view of the world, that sort of cult of the sort of cult of humanity, or the sort of cult of reason, is, like we sort of discussed earlier, is that it leads to fascism. It leads to death camps. It leads to indiscriminate violence, because all it cares about is instrumental reason. And that's something we talked about with Lasch. And what we should really care about is practical reason, which is that, using the tools of reason and science for moral ends. Yeah. That the ends matter. And so with that in mind, Sartre writes about what he says is existentialist humanism, which is that the pursuing of the transcendent as a way to affirm one's humanity. And what he means by that is pursuing values, projects, and goals that are larger than oneself. So whether it's belonging to a political party, fighting for the struggle on some front, whether it's, creating a piece of art or creating a piece of literature or, creating some beautiful music or any kind of artistic or creative activity that lives beyond your own life. All of those are worthwhile. And those are all things that humans all strive for. That's the universalism in it, is that striving for the transcendent, not in a sort of woo-woo spiritual sense, but in a real humanistic sense that's related to our own lives in a real universe. And and basically what that means is that we take responsibility for our choices, which we do have to do, but we also seek liberation as a means to actualize one's humanity. And so our choices are often hampered by the systems we live in. But the goal is to seek liberation, to expand the possibility of choices within that system. And that ultimately leads to an expansion of human freedom.
Right.
And this is the cool part. This is where I'm so excited to talk about this. I've never heard anybody say this in a writing, and it blew my mind, and I kind of love it. If you accept what Sartre has laid out for you, God does not matter.
Right.
So whether you believe in God or not, it's completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because we've developed a system, or we've developed a view of the world that doesn't need him. And that's the thing that's kind of beautiful about it, is acknowledging yeah, you could, but it wouldn't do anything.
Sure.
But just the idea that God doesn't matter. And he sort of says it in a phrase. He just sort of, he throws it off in a couple of sentences, and it just blew my mind. I've never heard anybody just say God doesn't matter. Because it really doesn't, right? Because if you think about it, whether or not God exists or not, we are still condemned to figure out how we live our lives here on this planet.
Yeah.
In this existence.
Yeah.
We're still stuck trying to figure it out because last I checked, no one's up there telling us what to do.
Right.
And so and even if they are telling us what to do, they're doing it in very subtle and often unacknowledged ways,
right,
which are completely indiscriminate from them not doing it at all. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there's an existentialism that does leave space for God, but just acknowledge that it's kind of irrelevant because there's no real. Once you take responsibility for the choices you have in your life, and once you take responsibility, once you have the knowledge that you have to make choices and are responsible for them, and that you're not just responsible to yourself, but you're responsible for others, God does pretty much become irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I know the instinct of many who are firm believers will be to say that obviously that they would think that that's not true, that God does matter and does still impact the way that they view their responsibilities.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually want to read the exact phrase because it's great. Existentialism is not so much an atheism in the sense that it would exhaust itself attempting to demonstrate the non-existence of God. It affirms that even if God were to exist, it would make no difference. Mm-hmm. That is our point of view. It's not that we believe that God exists, but we think that the real problem is not one of his existence. What man needs is to rediscover himself and to comprehend that nothing can save him from himself, not even valid proof of the existence of God.
Right. Yeah.
And then he sort of says, in this sense, existentialism is optimistic. It is a doctrine of action, and it is only in bad faith in confusing their own despair with ours that Christians are able to assert that we are without hope. Yeah. And so, I think that's kind of cool. I mean, because it kind of in just a very short few sentences, Sartre has basically told us that all of these God debates that we've done over the last
what a waste of time.
What a waste of fucking time they are. A complete and total waste of time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so that's really important. Last couple of notes I want to mention is, so that's the lecture part. And then there's a Q&A part.
Okay.
And in the Q&A part, the most of which is actually taken up by a very long-winded and boring statement made up by some asshole who decided to be a C-SPAN caller. And instead of just asking a quick question, went
more
on
of a comment, less a question.
He gave this long ass comment, to which Sartre says, and it's really funny. He says, let me see if I can find it. He says, it's rather difficult to answer you fully because you have said so many things. And it's like, yeah, I hate those kinds of people. Like, keep it short and brief.
The gish
but there are
gallop.
two things, the gish gallop, the person just throws all kinds of shit at you. And it's like, I can't respond to that. And a lot of times it's just somebody who wants to show off how smart they are.
Yep.
Like, shut the fuck up. Like, it's like Albert Einstein's thing. If you can't explain your concept to a child, your concept sucks.
Right.
And it's like, if you can't get your question down to at least a couple sentences, 2 or 3 sentences, then you suck at asking questions.
Yeah.
But in the Q&A section, he says 2 things that I think are relevant to political philosophy that I wanted to mention. The first one was that somebody asked him to make a distinction about, is Marx a philosopher or is he a revolutionary? And Sartre says, why not both? Like, he's both of those things.
Yeah, I don't see why he couldn't be.
And he's both a philosopher and a revolutionary. He was both of those things.
Yeah.
And that's because that's what it means to be dialectical. Those 2 things exist and they influence each other and they interact with one another. Yeah. And sometimes he's more of a revolutionary and sometimes he's more of a philosopher. Like,
depending on the context.
Depending on the context, right? The second thing that's really relevant, and I think this is relevant for folks who are interested in revolution and thinking about revolution as a concept, is he says that it's not enough to join a revolutionary party. You must also clarify what a revolution would really look like. And so what he means by that is that you can't just join it and just like, oh, great, we're going to have revolution now. Like, you actually really have to sit with your comrades and with yourself and ponder what revolution really would look like. What, and maybe you don't have a full answer. That's fine. But you do have to think about it.
Yeah.
Because if we are committed to a revolutionary project, as I am, as I know you are too, we have to think about what that would mean.
Yeah.
And how would that affect the people? What would it mean to carry out a program? All of those things. That matters. Because it's not enough just to say slogans and like, yay, I got my member card. Like, no, like the act of being a revolutionary is something that is a continually active pursuit. It's not something you do passively.
It seems like, I was thinking of course that's his answer. That fits exactly with the way that he's laid out this existential philosophy and the idea that we are responsible. And we have to be responsible if we're failing or if we're succeeding. We have to think about what we're doing and examine the context and where it's coming from. Of course, his answer says, yeah, you have to be in and thinking about what a revolution looks like.
Exactly. Because Sartre's view is really predicated on human action, that the centrality of human action, that we live in this universe and that within this universe that we're sort of condemned to be free. We have to make choices. We have to be responsible for ourselves and others because we're all we have. And when you know that, it gives you a sense of like anxiety, because I know it does for me, in the sense of like, holy shit, we have to figure this all out now. But it also gives me a real sense of optimism, because it means that we can write the story we want to, that we can fight for the future that we want. That the future is not written, that the past is dead and the future is unwritten, and all we have is the now, and all we have is this series of moments, and we can figure it out. And that sense of agency, that sense of having a sense of ownership in one's life, is something that I really love about existentialism, and it's what I really love about Sartre.
Right on. Anything left?
No, that's pretty much it. This was a short one because
perfect.
It's a short essay, but I think he packs in a lot of really great ideas. I highly recommend people check the book out. It's very, very short, but it's very easy to read, and it's really great. I mean, I think if you want to get a really good, sort of introductory notion of what Sartre is getting at here, I can't think of a better book to start with than this. And it's just fun every once in a while when you read somebody and you're like, right on, this is great. Like, I'm on this. This is wonderful. Yeah. Because sometimes you read stuff and you go, I don't know about that, or I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But I was just like, this is fantastic. And I think he gives a really good rebuttal to those who say that his philosophy is not materialistic in the philosophical sense, and those who think it's nihilistic and that it doesn't have any moral value. I think he thinks about morality far more seriously than a lot of other people do.
Right.
Precisely because he understands the stakes that go into the moral project when you abandon, traditional notions of morality, and especially notions related to God. So
Right. Great. So what are we going to cover next time?
Next time, we are going to be covering, although it probably will end up coming out in March, but we'll be covering for Black History Month an absolute classic. And we'll be covering Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class,
That's
which
awesome.
I've just started reading. I'm so excited to talk about this book. I love Angela Davis. And so that's going to be an incredible, I think, read to go through coming up. So I'm really excited about doing that next one.
That's awesome. And all that's left is, where can people find your stuff?
So people can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. That's where everything is. So all the podcast episodes, I almost said podcast. All the podcast episodes are available there. I have 2 new published works out recently. One is a full essay on Christopher Lasch and the Minimal Self, which is a full exposition of my ideas based on my conversation with Cory.
Nice.
And that's been published by Midwestern Marks. And then also I wrote an essay a couple of years ago about the secular humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz. And that essay has been republished by the Truth Seeker magazine. And those are both available at my website. And also, I was taking a bit of a social media hiatus. I'm sort of back on Instagram now, sort of in a less capacity. I post less now than I did. But you can also follow me there at Justin Clark PH for public history.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Justin, for another great review.
Thank you, Cory. I love doing these. This is amazing.
That's all, folks. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice, or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser or ratemypodcast.com would be great. If you want to find more from me, make sure to check out the show notes or check out my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other show, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, and a project I'm involved in with my friend Damien Marie at Hope that's called Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. You can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which is also found in my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's try to make sure we're applying critical thinking and reasoned skepticism when we're attacking the system. If we get caught up in bad thinking, we can derail ourselves.